Okay, we're starting our event. Welcome all today at FEPS. This event is actually part of a series of EU Investment Capacity Group, which is a project we do together, FEPS and Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, to contribute to the discussion about European budget and more broadly investment capacity. And we do discussion and also often accompanied by papers and policy briefs, and this is the case today. We commissioned a policy brief to Cornel Ban on the innovation financing in China and lessons for European Union. And so he's going to present today his findings. The paper is still work in progress to be finalized, so whatever comes out of today's discussion can feed into the paper. And what else? The event is public, it's streamed right now and will be available on record. I hope you don't mind to be photographed and videographed. And so, yes, this is, I think that's it for introduction. And now I give floor to our management, to our bosses, to Laszlo Andor from FEPS, and afterwards to Bess Morschel from FES Brussels office.
Thank you very much, Anna. Dear colleagues, guests, my role is simply to welcome you at FEPS and indeed express my appreciation for the commitment just a few days after Easter. I think it's indeed an interesting time to discuss economic policy and finance, but we can do it in the company and with the support of remarkable experts of this topic today. I would like to highlight that the partnership with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is really absolutely crucial for FEPS. We really cherish the commitment which we have had, and especially in the interest of promoting progressive economic policy. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that the European Union is in the need of a proper economic doctrine. Seemingly, we have one, because in the last 18 months or 2 years, officials in Brussels wake up and say a prayer for the Draghi report and the implementation of all this. But we also believe that there is a lot of misunderstanding regarding the sources of competitiveness, the sources of sustainable economic growth, and what kind of economic model we would need to develop. So I believe that the discussion today will also help with this clarification and also put it into the context of finance. There is an ongoing debate about the multi-annual financial framework of the European Union, which again introduced competitiveness in a very interesting way. Some pluses, but also some controversies have emerged in this field since last summer. So we believe that some lessons can be drawn from the discussion today. We always count on the very active participation of the audience, and I believe after all the presentations and the expert discussion, there will be no shortage of this. So with this, I would like to hand over the microphone to Tobias.
Well, thank you very much, Laszlo. Good afternoon, colleagues, friends. I'm Tobias Morschel, heading the FES office here in Brussels. And as Laszlo said, the cooperation between Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and FEPS is very crucial and fundamental, also for us as Friedrich Ebert Foundation, and also especially in this kind of format which we are having now for the second year. And we are speaking today about scaling up. I would say, if I look in the room, so many people here in the room and also online, we are also scaling up our events on this issue, and it shows how important it is to talk on what we can learn from China. And the paper which we are going to discuss, which is going to be written by Cornel Ban, and I think it has quite an optimistic message in one sense, that the EU doesn't lack talent or resources of investment, but we have to coordinate better and to be more strategic. And how to do it, what we can learn in this regard from China, I think that's really, really interesting, and also will be very helpful for us, and therefore I'm really thankful for your paper. also for you, for the people who are going to give a comment. So what we need to do, that we don't have to need to become China, but we can learn from China in certain regards. And I'm really very much looking forward for our talk this afternoon. Also afterwards, read the whole re-edited paper. And thank you very much, Cornel, for your paper. And with that, I want to hand over to Anna, who is going to be the moderator of the event. Anna.
Thank you for the introduction. So I will just briefly introduce Cornel. He is an associate professor at Copenhagen Business School in Denmark, and before he was associate professor in he was worked in the City University of London and was assistant professor at Boston University and held some other positions. His main field is international political economy, comparative political economy, sociology, and economic history. He wrote 2 books and a dozen articles and book chapters on the politics of economic expertise and income distribution, macroeconomic policy shifts, and organizational shifts in international financial institutions, and capitalist diversity in Europe and also in several other countries in Latin America. So his most recent interest is China. He will explain us maybe briefly why, but he, like over the last several years, he already established himself as a China expert on industrial policy, financing, especially in the comparative perspective to European Union. So without any further ado, I offer floor to Cornel.
Oh, yeah, sorry. My wife says that I cannot whisper, so that's why I'm not worried about microphones. Thank you, very honored to be here. And for a bit of context, I've been working on China for the last 5 years. We have the advantage in Denmark that a consortium of Danish universities have had an academic presence in the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which is one of the leading academic institutions in China, in Beijing. And we have, we do a double degree and PhD and master level. And I teach in China once a year. I do field work. So in total, I spend a month and a half every year in China in the last 3 years. But I've been working and teaching on it in the last 5 years. And it was only in the last year that I had the courage to finally send the stuff out for review. So I have a book and 6 articles. Some of them are out, some of them are forthcoming in the next few weeks, some of them. And the focus of that is organized around the single question that I'm interested in as a European. And that question is that China is not just an example of a global south, quote unquote, economy catching up with Europe. It is an economy that is leapfrogging Europe. And European industrial economy hasn't had that challenge in a very, very long time. It had a little bit of a Japan shock, but Japan was manageable by comparison, right? We're talking about an economy that, according to the critical technologies tracker, right, dominates most critical technologies, right? And it dominates particularly those technologies where the European firms have had a comparative advantage for over a century, and that is industrial manufacturing. And there's a very good book by Kyun Lee, who advised, came out with the Oxford University Press. He advised the Korean president, previous Korean president, and he demonstrates at the sectoral and firm level how China basically is leapfrogging in most sectors. We have very few sectors left. Aeronautics, pharma to some extent. Coming from Denmark, a clean tech champion, this is why I became really interested, right? I started speaking with Chinese wind turbine companies, and these are one of the areas that Europe dominates, right, for decades. We still have 70% of the global market. And they were freaking out. So I'm like, were you freaking out? I mean, this is like the most likely case of a very well-run European economy with a lot of pension fund financing, pillar 2 really strong, right? Where competitiveness and social democracy work hand in hand, where you have world-class technical universities, and you're freaking out. So, and they said, look, you have to go to see what's coming from China, because we just see the stuff in the market. It's extremely innovative. It's very precise. It's stuff that we thought it takes decades of implicit knowledge to build. So there is something about China that's not just about cutting costs and about managing demand. It is about commercializing innovation 8 or 9 times faster than us. We don't know why that's happening, because that's not what we do in China. And they have a big factory in Shanghai, etc. So this is, what is China? China is a country that has brought online in critical niches of the European economy what we would call manufacturing unicorns, right? How many European manufacturing unicorns have we produced in the last 10 years? Because every one that I count in China, yeah, BYD, Cattle, Huawei, are 10 to 15 years old. Some are 5 years old, right? One of China's biggest EV companies, where Stellantis now is the majority shareholder because they want to learn how to make electric cars, is 6 years old. This is the topic I'm speaking to today. Because I think we need, and this will be my main argument, right? We need this moment where we mobilize the current resources to leapfrog the Chinese. I think we need to not be defensive, but to be offensive on this. And leapfrogging not in this kind of ineffective geo-economic decoupling from China kind of way, because we've kind of tried that and it doesn't really work well. But in a way that leverages the European still advanced technological innovation ecosystem, our immense pools of capital, particularly in the pension arena, and it leverages something that the United States doesn't have, which is that unlike the US, Europe is the only peer competitor to China in manufacturing. Not for, I don't know for how long, but we're still in the game. The US is kind of out of that game in manufacturing. Just look at their current account and you can see what I'm talking about. And second, unlike the United States, Europe has still a lot of assets that are owned by the EU or the member states in finance, in energy, in infrastructure, that can be leveraged in order to have a more directed provision of risk capital that can essentially finance that leapfrogging process I'm talking about. Okay? This is the main argument. If I were to distill the many points and the chaos that the paper looks like right now. So maybe I'll go in the presentation mode now. Basically, this is a question. This is a question that a Chinese CFO asked me, right? Because I started my interview saying, you know, there's so much waste in China, right? I mean, you guys shower everybody with subsidies. Europe is angry at you. We're putting tariffs. This is not good, right? They said, yeah, sure. How much did we spend? How much did you guys say that we spent on subsidies in the car industry? 200 billion. All right. You should just look at the other stuff that you don't look at, right? Which is the kind of financing ecosystem that we provide, right? And they ask you, how many unicorns, industrial unicorns, have you guys produced? Because basically China is a unicorn industrial economy, right? And it's true for both in industry, so manufacturing with the European specialization, and for digital, the American one. And you know what the CEO of NVIDIA says. I mean, he's putting his money on China to win the AI race because AI is all about scaling energy, right? And who do you think is going to scale energy faster, China or the US in this regard? And the way the Chinese are planning that financing ecosystem for data centers and for the digital and semiconductor side of AI is yet another aspect of this complicated story I'm providing here. So they're challenging both Europe and US on both industry and digital services at the same time, right? This is an infrastructural challenge. And it's not something that we should take in a kind of defensive, warlike, aggressive, you know, decoupling, like an East German strategy of decoupling. This is not how we should think this through. Instead, it's about rewiring how we reorganize the European commercialization of innovation ecosystem. Okay. Let me see if this is spinning. Okay, great. The problem here is well known. This is Draghi, so I'm coming from the Draghi report, the second value of that. So basically, we're doing pretty well, and I think many of my reviewers here in the room agree on this. We're doing pretty well in seed financing and early stage financing, both on the public and private side. What we miss on is this 350 billion a year for scale-up capital, right? That's the bit, right? So I'm arguing that for decades, we have looked at the US, Silicon Valley, MIT corridor as the model of how to finance technological innovation and how to finance the commercialization of innovation. Yeah? And I think that's great. I think that's very good for the digital sector. But hard tech is a very different topic. It's much more capital intensive. You have to build whole factories, not just buy computers and have data centers and digital infrastructures that are not as expensive as hard tech factories are. You have to establish supply chains that are very complex with a lot more risk. So you're a lot less likely to get money from that. So I argue here that there is a sort of Sino-Chinese manufacturing global value chain complex. And in that, if you look at the Europe-China relationship as a value chain, that value chain started with high value added being European, and now it's turning around. And the risk is that we might become the semi-periphery of a Chinese core of many value chains, from the car industry to many forms of clean tech and telecom, right? This is the problem that we're trying to address. So my main argument here is that, of course, we're not China. We're not their political system. We don't have their bureaucracy. We don't have the fragmented authoritarianism. But there are elements of the Chinese financial ecosystem that are just forms of plumbing. They are nothing, they're not a political project. They don't depend on the authoritarian state. They depend on many iterated forms of experimentation the Chinese provinces and central authorities and private sector have done over the last 2 decades. And that, I agree, is a form of constitutional advantage almost, because they can pilot things at the provincial level. And if they work, they can scale them. And that's something that in the European intergovernmental governance system is a lot harder to do. But maybe the political side can think through how to organize something like that. So this is just basic literacy, the first value of that, the second value of that. I don't think I need to elaborate that much. This is where our big difference with China is, right? I think on early innovation and industrial deployment, I think we're doing reasonably well. And Lorenzo is here, and he has a research showing that we're doing much better than we thought with government venture capital in these stages. But in the growth financing side, where European startups and mid-caps can go into IPO stages and like really become global multinational firms in new sectors from scratch, the Chinese beat the shit out of us, right? They have companies that went from 0 to 50 billion valuation in a little over a decade. And they are basically monopolistic, quasi-monopolistic actors in that market. Just think of the battery and energy storage, right? Basically, you have LG and CATL BYD, right? And the Chinese are more innovative and have better prices and better supply chains security than the Koreans have, right? So the problem with us is neither the money nor the technology and the innovation. The problem with us is fragmentation, okay? So these are some of the numbers that you're all familiar with. The public share of VC in Europe, about 31%, much higher than in America, by the way. If we were to take this out, we would have a lot less innovation in Europe. So for those who are agonizing over having too much state in Europe, right, also look at this very Schumpeterian creative destruction financing, right? The problem is 80% of the public VC system is very unfocused, right? The difference with the Chinese is that it would be the other way around. Like 80% would be part of some kind of technology mandates that these financing channels owned by the state, municipalities, and provinces would have. It's a very targeted, well-organized system across the whole value chain that manages, in collaboration with provincial authorities and central authorities, both the supply and the demand. Because the problem with many of our pension funds is that they're not sure where the demand would be, how safe the demand is, so they don't have to wreck the lives of the pensioners, right? And we have many negative examples with Northvolt, where the pension funds, Nordic pension funds have lost a lot of money in a European IPCI. So in one of the most developmental network state experiences that Europe has had recently. So I think the framework we have to adopt is what I call, using Laurits Vag-Simonsen, whom you met, is a Danish private venture capitalist, a hyper-transformation framework. Hard tech is very different from software. And we have worked with a VC mindset in Europe that is designed for software, not for hard tech. And if you're thinking with the assumption that we should devise public venture capital meant for industry, then it's a much more complicated story that is summarized here in this regard, and that requires much more complex interventions. These are some of the numbers. I'm just going to skip on this. 13 trillion in pension funds, 82% foreign-led scale-up in Europe, right? Not domestic. 50% acquired by non-EU entities. We're basically doing a lot of brain drain in Europe, right? Fantastic research and development in European universities. We scale them up to some point. When they need 300 million euros, they are bought by somebody else, right? So it's basically a form of brain drain, because it's public financing of innovation that in its advanced commercialization phase goes away. So we can't really build those companies that the Chinese have on the other side. I'm just going to go because it's obviously in the interest of time. What has been the Chinese instrument? It's something called the government guidance funds. And these funds are complex. On the one hand, they look like European, they look like EIF, or they look like KfW Capital, the sort of venture arm of the German development bank. But they're not just for early stage innovation. They're also scale-up funds. And in some cases, they morph into infrastructure funds. So they're very complex, nimble forms that represent the kind of dirigist, etatist, interventionist view that China is known for. But on the other hand, the way they take risk, they look like Silicon Valley velociraptor funds, right? I mean, these are very high risk appetite organizations. And you have here some of the numbers I did, like who are the shareholders typically. And this is something that we need to think through. How would we fund something like this? So first is they're much, much bigger than what we have, but not by a lot bigger. So essentially, if you look at the first one, so South Korea, which is the epiphenomenal developmental state, you're looking at public innovation finance. It's basically 0.48% of GDP. Yeah, I should speak into this. And then we do almost as well, 0.17. We're not that liberal, right? In other words, China, 0.7%, right? So it's basically 6 times more as a percentage of the total financial sector. I mean, we're basically looking at about 600 billion a year. That's publicly owned venture capital. Now, venture capital plus, right? Remember that I said it's more than pure VC. Now, how are the shareholders organized? You'd think it's Beijing, right? That's what everybody assumes, like Beijing, a big authoritarian state, right? Well, Ministry of Finance usually has about 17% on average. And then this is an example of one of the Ningbo funds. Other than, it's really not that. It's to some extent state-owned banks, state-owned insurance companies, and what the Chinese call stale capital, meaning SOEs that are in sectors with very low productivity horizons. China Tobacco Company, what can you invent in that area? Gas companies, utilities, right? So a part of their dividends are channeled away from the state's coffers, and they go into these risk funds. And then these funds are funds of funds, who then set up sub-funds with sectoral specialization across the value chain, the whole value chain of the sector they speak to. So if it's a guidance fund for the car industry, the sub-funds would be batteries, electronics, critical minerals, chargers, and the way they are managed, they have a lot of engineering. This is all public information, by the way. I got almost everything from peer-reviewed literature and databases you can buy in China. And a lot of scholars based outside of China who write about China. A lot of Australian, Singaporean researchers. So as you can see here, it's a way of taking some state assets that would like sit dormant or be just fiscal resource, and they kind of do this alchemy. They convert it into high-risk appetite capital, right? This is, I don't know how to call this. I call it sometimes dirigist developmentalism, but it's very Schumpeterian and risk-taking in many ways. By sector, this is another big difference with us. They pick the sectors and they go for the highest value added, and they go for niches that they want to control globally. And just look at the distribution. I have an appendix in the study. So it's digital, digital healthcare, very little on generalist, right? This is just Korea, and I don't know why I don't have China here. But it's basically robotics, chips, AI, clean tech. Basically, wherever you see China as being like, all of a sudden they erupt into the market, it comes after years of very quiet investment in this regard. Okay. Further, how much time do I have? Because I don't want to overrule here.
5 more minutes.
Oh, baby. Okay, that's crazy. Then, these are some of the examples of the big Chinese multinational companies, XPeng Motors. I mean, this is the scale-up function of this fund. The Guangzhou government basically had the 4 billion renminbi financing of a new factory. That's a typical scale-up. And multiply this by thousands of firms. I mean, this is happening on a regular basis in China. Same for green hydrogen. You're going to see them coming into that space very soon. Do they actually work? There is a lot of quantitative research on this. They work under certain conditions. They don't work all the time. So this study, which is an Australian study, looked at 4,700 firms, and they found that partially government-owned venture vehicles, because like in Europe, these GGFs are meant to crowd in private capital, right? And they do that all the time. So when they go into not fully publicly owned, but partially, and usually it's like 78%, municipal, provincial, or state ownership, they do much better than if they're fully publicly owned, right? The statistics are very clear. The exit years are falling. In terms of innovation, basically, the probability of having more high-quality patents increases with the shareholding positions of a GGF, right? And on average, they have better innovation outcomes than when firms are financed solely by private venture capital. This is the data that these guys have produced. So a third intervening variable here is that not everybody does well. Like, it's the guidance funds based in already sophisticated industrial hubs with a lot of implicit knowledge, like the huge robotics and electronics centers, Hangzhou, Guangdong, and others, where they do really well. They try to set them up in areas that had good universities, but not a lot of manufacturing sophisticated ecosystem, and they had to close them down. So, yeah, I mean, how much they care about returns? Not much in the short term, but you're not allowed to make a lot of losses. So there is discipline. If you're like a serial loser, they shut you down. If you don't make any returns, but you hit your technology targets and your province or your city becomes, generates these industrial unicorns, and you run on zero or low low returns for years, they don't care, right? Because in the long term, their exposure is quite long, and so they get in a lot of income through that. The Chinese call this the shareholding state. There is a whole book that demonstrates this. So a lot of non-fiscal income of the Chinese state comes from the innovative sectors that the state funded as a shareholder. So this is maybe of interest to you in Europe, where we have a bit of a fiscal problem, to think about that. I don't think I need to elaborate of why we can't replicate this in full. I think it's very clear. 80% of Chinese finance is state-owned. So they have absolutely immense behemoths in banking and finance and asset management. And they are shareholders in this. So take that off the table. We have much, we're talking many, many trillions, right? Now, good news is this, right? Good news is that in many advanced sectors, we still lead on advanced patents in Europe. Our commercialization rate is a lot smaller than in China for reasons that have to do with this. But the good news is, the second piece of good news is that European Union level institutions have understood the Chinese model, I think. And I don't know, I mean, some people from the Commission here, but I think some of the institutions that have been created recently, or some of the old institutions that are being repurposed, kind of reflect a philosophy about second value of that is a problem, and scale up is a problem. So in some ways, the EIC accelerator, the ETCI are there. The difference, though, is that, is what I highlighted here, right? I mean, basically, we still don't have the binding sectoral priorities. I mean, that's something that's constitutionally imposed on these funds. And it's imposed on them because they care about the deep implicit engineering expertise that the management of the funds operates with. Basically, they're managed by people who are half finance, half engineering. And the engineers are much more risk accepting because they understand the technology. They don't freak out, right? And that's something that maybe in the corporate governance of how we run things in Europe is something to consider. Like, what's the professional nature of the managers? And we talked to Lorenzo last night about that a little bit. But in general, I know there is a risk in picking sectors. There's a very rich literature on this. But I think we have to study a bit more under what conditions it's a real risk. Yeah? Because at the end of the day, we have a leapfrogging problem. How are we going to address that? We have been having a solution that was not devised for this particular challenge. So what are the lessons? So one is to aggregate capital at scale. Essentially, pool national promotional bank capital through more VC scale-up financing rather than loans. That's one big one. I mean, loans have the role. They're very important in de-risking. Stronger sector specialization. We are too generalist in the way we organize equity investment. And I think if you read Dan Wang's book, right, on China, there is the implicit engineering knowledge that really moves the country forward. And we are not building that muscle. So without the engineering sectoral specialization of the sub-funds, we're going to have a very hard time competing with our Chinese friends. Expanding the available pool of publicly owned capital, right? I mean, and centralize a bit more. Denmark has centralized all this fund into one. I mean, because they realize the problems they have. They are, as a result, much better at crowding in private capital now. And then there is something about management of demand. And we have the national competitiveness plans that can work in here, connecting universities with VC. I mean, the biggest Chinese polytechnics have their own VC arms. And the VC arm connect with the local municipal or provincial guidance funds so that everything that comes out of advanced doctoral programs is commercialized within months. It's really, really fast. Then the very large Chinese global companies buy them out, right? Thus upgrading their own innovation ecosystems. These are some of the examples I have become familiar with. I mean, the good news is that in Europe we have the Fraunhofer model and also the Danish Skylab. So we have some European examples. It's not that China, but China operates at one university has basically 2 billion. Right? I mean, this is almost as big as the scale-up fund of the whole of the EU, right? This is just one technical university in China. So there is a matter of scale we can't possibly avoid. We have to think that through and think of what's the politics of scaling the available public capital. I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to speed through this. Yeah, several minutes. Okay, MFF. Okay, this is important because I think if we just talk about government venture capital, and we don't think about the broader coordination ecosystem, I think we're going to lose the money and the political support, and we might burn through available political desire to actually take these risks, right? So, in a way, the way we design procurement in the MFF, right? The way we plan the IPCIs, the way national, regional, or EU level public investors take risks in IPCIs and coordinate with each other, the way the general block exceptions are allowed, the way state aid is orchestrated, and they have to work with the redesign of the pool of capital, public pool of capital available. So in a way, Europe actually has to do a lot better than China and the US. The Americans have money through the wazoo, they have the reserve currency, they have the biggest financial center, they get everybody's money, right? I don't know for how long, because they're actually working on reducing that advantage these days. The Chinese have immense pools of public capital, right? So they can afford wasting a little bit, yeah? We can't afford that. We can never come anywhere close to either the American immense pools of private capital or to the immense pools of public capital in China. So what we have to use much more smartly, much more targeted, with much more expertise, much more sectoral and subsectoral specialization, if we are to stand a chance as an industrial continent in 10, 15 years. Yeah? And that means that MFF reform has to figure this in. What kind of coordination mechanisms do we need to do a sort of value chain planning, in a sense, to choose some priorities, not all priorities, to have a more directive approach and less of a generalist approach with how we use the sparse public capital that's available. I think the national regional partnership plans can be one way to do that. I mean, there's very good research by Giuseppe Testa and others showing they looked at 38 regional plans in Europe. It's a complete mess. They reflect local pet projects, uncoordinated in the value chain. Small wonder nothing gets up into like a, big European innovative firms that can compete globally, right? So I don't have an answer to how to fix that, but I just want to put it on the table because we are dealing with an actor that has not only a 5-year plan system that is very reflexive and very decentralized, and it works, contrary to the conventional wisdom we've been taught in university. This is not a Soviet system they have. It's more like a combination. Imagine a combination of Silicon Valley with French indicative planning in the 60s and 70s. Back when France was migrating towards becoming a crazy technological innovator and scaler of nuclear, high-speed trains, aircraft, etc. This is what, and with a lot of developmental state lessons from Asia. It's a very pragmatic hybrid. They don't care about the intellectual implications and the consistency of it all. What matters is that they run it into experiments across provinces until the whole damn thing works. And they keep upgrading it, right? It's a very reflexive kind of system. So one of the ideas that my reviewers liked was to mandate design under the MFF and InvestEU, especially in the technology sub-funds that I mentioned earlier on, and national co-anchoring through the national promotional banks. And so basically, to use the MFF and InvestEU as a way of coordinating EU-level public investing with regional and national venture capital and public development banks and SOEs in a way that you manage both the risk capital and the demand pipeline across the way. Because we have a 2 trillion euro procurement fund. I mean, essentially, we have a 6-year plan in Europe, right? I mean, quote unquote plan. But it expresses that kind of logic. Europe has a long planning tradition. My personal view is that the highest level of planning capability is at the level of the Commission, and the Commission is already engaging in planning. I mean, DG NEAR is one of them, etc. Right? So, in that regard, we are more like China and less like the US. I mean, there is a long 80 years of tradition in this regard. But we need to rethink this when it comes to a competition that you cannot take for granted that you're the winner in. The scale-up fund, I think the scale-up fund, I really love the scale-up fund, sorry if anybody doesn't like the scale-up fund here, but again, essentially, sometimes in some technologies where you can assess pretty objectively what the risks of crowding out are, I think that maybe the scale-up fund might run the risk of emphasizing too much being the minority co-investor, right? And sometimes you just have to go guns blazing on being the majority investor, co-investor, and just take the risk. And it's something the Chinese have done across many of the sectors where they emerged as the winners, okay? So I think maybe, I don't know how to do this, I don't know the exact implications. I'm bringing you the message from the other side, because they have not refrained from taking that risk. And sometimes we kind of set a dilemma: do you want returns? Or do you want market niche? And the answer in China is like, it depends. On the time scale, it depends on the technology, it depends on whether private VC wants to do it. If they want to do it, they can be the majority, that's fine. But we're not going to turn that into an orthodoxy, right? We're going to go case by case, technology by technology, segment of the value chain by segment of the value chain. We often have this tendency to have these big doctrinal proclamations that hold across technologies, and that simply is not borne by evidence. This is going to be controversial. I mean, one of the Chinese lessons is that if we're serious, I mean, there are European public enterprises that do really well, right? And they have windfall income, especially in energy, right? Some of those dividends should go into risk capital. This would be a Chinese lesson. The political implications are complicated, I'm aware of that, given our fiscal situation. But then, remember, Chinese provinces have to balance budget. They have to have zero deficit. They are in permanent austerity, right? So because they can't use a lot of fiscal resources and throw grants at people, yeah, they do it through these financial channels, and they find that the returns after 7, 8 years are much bigger than if they had taken all the dividends from the state-owned companies into the public budget. So it is a way that deals with the fiscal constraints on the Chinese provinces to have this shareholding view of government income. So I'm going to end here and just say, I have become convinced after 5 years that the main reason why China does so well in industrial, but also digital service competition is not because they're authoritarian. And I think we have to let that go. That is a very easy, and I would argue lazy view of why China does well. It's because they have pilot tested to death forms of coordination and risk-taking in the public sector that links up with the best energies of their hyper-competitive, very liberal otherwise, market competition space. I mean, most of these firms are privately owned. But talk to anybody in that space, they will tell you, if it weren't for the coordination capabilities of the Chinese state and the types of risk capital that are available, we would not be here. And with that.
Thank you, Cornel. Very inspiring. So we go to comments. So we have some commentators who actually read the paper, some didn't read the paper, and then we open to the general discussion. First in our line is Călin Danilescu, who is Policy Officer in DG Internal Market, Industry Entrepreneurship and SME at European Commission. So we try to limit comments up to 5 minutes.
Many thanks, Anna, and many thanks, Cornel, for the invitation, and many thanks, Cornel, for the presentation. Actually, you did a bit of that back in January, and we heard of you. I will try to stick to what we do in Europe in this respect. Although I have a couple of links to your paper. Well, the good news is that, well, let's start with the story. Actually, what we do in Europe, actually, currently, we need to put it into a different perspective, in the sense like we started from quite far. So back in 5 years ago, for instance, at the level of the Commission, we would use instruments like guarantees, essentially, and grants to support SMEs, innovative SMEs. And since then, we understood that we have a couple of problems from that, and we created a tool that Cornel already mentioned, which is the EAC accelerator, which is actually the first tool for the time being when the Commission invests directly in companies. So since then, we have invested in something like 440 companies for 1.7 billion. And this instrument, at least, I mean, like it's a good combination of what money can do and policy. Because going back to what Cornel said about what's the role of the public money here? Is it there for impact or is it there for return? So if I take the EAC accelerator, an instrument which I know well because I've been involved in the last 5 years and a half in that. So essentially what we try to do is to create an ecosystem in order for, well, IP to stay in Europe, jobs to stay in Europe, value in general to stay in Europe. So basically entrepreneurs and innovative companies to try to find in Europe what they would try to find actually elsewhere, maybe US or the thing is that it's a complicated story to put in the same basket both the impact and the returns, because, well, ultimately the way, for instance, the EAC accelerator is working is like we combine public money with private money, so we never invest alone, right? And from this perspective, we have also some policy objectives, because we have the program managers that are looking for a couple of, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 challenges each year on the basis of policies, and coming back to sectors investment. And so the Commission would select that particular challenges in a specific industry. And the good thing is we will invest equity in that company if there are private investors willing to invest also their money. Meaning that they will have skin in the game, and at that point in time, the Commission will come in and will invest as a balanced fund. One good thing of what is happening now is, in a way, what you try to put on paper in your presentation also, is like the future ECF will work a bit in this direction, actually, trying to encompass pretty much everything, in the sense like we speak about like the researcher journey in a way where basically we will support the research, well, an idea from the very research up to deployment. Are the funds enough? Well, in general, they're never enough. Can they be compared with what you said about China? No, but also we need, you put it right actually in your paper, that we need to see what kind of, well, entities we are speaking about. And indeed, I mean, like China, the capital you are speaking about is coming from public, while actually only partially is coming from public resources. And I mean, we acknowledge that there is a problem with the fragmentation, and there are a couple of ideas on how to help, for instance, companies to from one specific country to find capital in other countries, including via acknowledging some state aid rules being a bit alleviated. So from this perspective, I would say that, so the ECF and the fact that one of the ultimate goals of its ultimate goals is to scale up all these industrial developments. I think that's good news in a way. But That would be a complicated story to make a comparison, just because we have 27 member states with different interests, with different fiscal policies, with different, well, some not monetary policies. But that's a complicated statement to say that at one point in time that would be fully aligned. But with all the tools I think we have in place, like the accelerator, the Scale Up Europe Fund, the fact that the scalability will take place under the ECF, and also, as a matter of fact, I mean, as a personal note, when we invest in strategic companies in the AC fund, we have clauses in the investment that the IP and the headquarters should remain in Europe. So we try to build various ecosystems to help all these companies to perform and stay here with the value they create, the jobs and IP and so on. But I think can I have a question for you now or maybe later? Because you discussed, you presented the system quite well, but one question which remain with me is like, well, venture capital more than private equity, it's a sector which is very prone to failure, right? So in Europe we have a different approach of failure compared to the States, and that's in a way my question. So I read recently in a book that until a couple of years ago in France, for instance, if you failed with your company, well, you were put on a list and your name would be kind of written off after 3 or 5 years, which is obviously completely different from what they do in the States. But the question is not there. So in the whole ecosystem, in your research, what was your understanding about how the Chinese, for instance, embraced failure?
Great question. 1 minute answer. They were very risk averse culturally. And then Chinese banks were some of the world's most conservative institutions. The Communist Party of China was unhappy with that. And they said, we have to create institutions that make people accept risk like crazy. So if you're based in Shenzhen, you can, I had interviews with American innovators who moved from Boston to Shenzhen. They said they had 18 failed startups and they still get money. So basically there's so much available high-risk capital that the culture, the perception of risk has changed. It's basically, but we can't do that. We don't have that level of deep risk capital market that they have there. But basically, I mean, when you talk to Chinese innovators, they have this kind of imperial view how they're going to take the whole global market. I mean, this is they are not modest at all. I mean, this is a very carnivorous, risk-accepting culture that when we encounter people there, this is the vibe, right? But also there's a vibe that if they fail, they fail. There's no cost, essentially. And you're kind of almost rewarding for failure if you show improvement. It's like for scholars who failed the ERC, right? I failed the ERC first time. The second time, I got an interview. If I fail it, they encourage you to go the third time. So it's kind of that feeling because there's still a pool of money available. There's no stigma management that you're talking about. But that is a material, it's not cultural, culture changes. And it changed in response to incentives. And the incentives were, you fail, there's more money available. If it's not your municipality, it's the guy next door, it's going to be there, the money. But then we're talking big money here that's available for this.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, colleague.
Is Dora Piroshka, who joins us online. She's Associate Professor at Central European University.
Yes, hello everyone. It was a pleasure listening to Cornel's presentation and reading his reports. It's so full of ideas that it's really a challenge to comment, not just to think through many of the ideas he put on the table. I prepared you 3 things that are kind of my takeaways from reading the report, and then 3 things that are kind of missing for me from the report. So the first thing that I really, really liked in Cornel's observation is Europe's over-reliance on the private sector for projects evaluation. So this I find very, very important because this puts all the Draghi report in question in a sense that the Capital Markets Union and the Savings and Investments Union are failed projects, failed institutional innovations precisely because they would just accelerate over-reliance on private evaluation for value. Whereas what Europe probably needs, it's a social evaluation for value combined with private evaluation of value. And this is what I think one can learn from China. The second thing I really liked in the report is the emphasis on market coordination that has been also mentioned before here by others, that in order for a sector to scale up, it's not enough to finance single projects within that sector. There's a need for a market coordinated approach that would also finance infrastructure development, logistics, value chains, regulatory changes, and make finance available. Scaling up single companies or single projects are simply impossible. Scaling up means scaling up all market segments. And that, I think, is very valuable lesson. And finally, I really, really appreciate in the report the emphasis on combining social goals with profit-oriented goals when evaluating certain projects. So it's not only that the Chinese are picking out a lot of projects that may or may not deliver, they also picking up a lot of projects and combining them in the same financial framework that serve various purposes and not only profit and shareholder value creation purposes. So these are the three things I really very much appreciated in the report. And then I have three things that kind of answer the question, so how to get there from Europe? How to achieve those kind of innovative scales that we see in China. So one thing that has also been mentioned now, but maybe it's not so highlighted in the report, is scaling up from a small-scale experiment of market coordination into provincial and then national and then international levels. So the Chinese way of transformation, as Isabella Weber also observed, has started with the transformation of the Chinese Development Bank. And the Chinese Development Bank was coordinating in the Wuhu province, if I understood correctly, something that has then worked. There were trial and failure at the institutional level, and then it was scaled to the national and then the international level. So this is something that Europe can also do, experimenting with institutional solution or just looking at institutional solutions that work and then scale up at other places. One of the second point I want to make is that one of the heroes of Cornel's paper is the EIB, because the EIB has so much potential in actually carrying out some of these scaling up financing projects. And there is also a lot of criticism in the report on the EIB, why it is not doing that. So I would like to highlight something about the EIB, which is also contextualizes all what we are talking from kind of a democratic and also a European Union perspective. The EIB is a very, very particular body in Europe. It is not governed by elected politicians. It's neither governed by technocrats. It's governed by member states representatives who make decisions on certain member states defined shares of the total voting right. And this is problematic for Europe because there is no one at the table, at the EIB decision-making body, which would represent European common interest. And this you can actually see from how EIB finances. EIB finances primarily national projects. If you look at the share of cross-border financing of the EIB share, it's tiny, it's below 5% of the total financing. So if there are no cross-border railways, highways, logistic logistic ways or value chains, then we have a problem of how EIB is actually looking at Europe. So one way to start reforming European institutions might be actually to looking at how the EIB is governed and strengthen the representation of the common European interest. And my final point is about something which is also missing a little bit from the report, is the role of European private commercial banks. So there's a lot of talk in the report about how venture capitals and fund of funds can actually innovate finance. But we've seen in the past that European banks have been able to, upgrade the German industry in the 19th century and have been able to hold the hands of small and medium-sized enterprises to scale up. But unfortunately, since the 2008 financial crisis, European commercial banks turned away from real sector financing and started financing financial activities on on international financial markets that might provide a faster profit and increase their shareholders. But of course, it's very bad news for Europe and industrial upgrading in Europe. So my recommendation would be also to consider redesigning commercial banks' regulatory framework in a way that they would be more interested in channeling finance to European industry. Thank you so much. Thank you, Cornel. The report is excellent, and I really recommend it for everyone for thoughts. Thank you.
I think we'll move straight to the next speaker, who is Lorenzo Moretti, Research Fellow at the European University Institute. Also lead for Italy and Head of Advisory at Lewis Hub for New Industrial Policy and Governance.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Super interesting event, and congratulations for putting together this type of reflection between policymakers and academics. I think is hugely valuable for both. And thank you, Cornel, for the great paper. I learned a lot from reading it and also from our discussions. So thanks a lot. So I'll try to be quick, and I'll also say 3 things that I really liked about the paper and 3 areas where I have concerns or additional reflections. So the 3 things that I really liked are, first of all, at the most basic level, the importance of learning from China, despite it being a completely different political economic system. The second, the value chain perspective that the Chinese have. And then the third is about coordination and priority setting. So let me go through those. On the importance of learning from China. So China is a completely different system, both politically and economically, but I think your insight that we can learn from it, at least some principles or some elements, is very important. And it's particularly important when we think about industrial policy, because the reality is that if we look at these most successful historical examples of industrial policy, a lot of them come from non-democratic, not sort of liberal market economies, which doesn't mean at all that we want to replicate that political system. It just means we cannot ignore those success cases just because of the political system that supported them. We should instead try to extrapolate what is indeed transferable. So I think that's a very first important contribution that should be stressed. The second point on supply chain, I really think the paper shows how the Chinese policymakers think about sectors. They think about industries, while in Europe for a long time, and I think we still do, we tend to think in terms of policymaking about types of companies, which is very important, but I think we're getting to the point where it's clear that probably it's not enough. It's not sufficient to design everything that we want and to achieve our goals. Instead, the example of the GFFs, these, the government guidance funds, it really shows how the Chinese integrate different players in the value chain, and also the different policy levers, from fiscal to investment, equity, but also the role of state-owned enterprises, etc. And then there is the general point about coordination and priority settings. So that to me is probably the most important lesson for Europe. So these government guidance funds and the approach is clearly not just a vehicle for investing. They are kind of like the practical means to respond to policy targets that come from above and that they are clear. So these policy targets are not in themselves, from my understanding and from the conversations we had, they're not very precise in themselves in how to achieve them. And instead, the government funds are sort of a system that has come up to achieve those targets. But these policy targets are very important because they align the whole system in China, the provinces, the local actors, it aligns them towards a goal. And the goal is clear, and all these actors believe that there will be consistency in those objectives. So it's political signaling, but very effective political signaling. And it's signaling about the fact that both funding, but also a market, like a demand, will be there for those industries and those products. And I think that's something that we really can learn from. Because in Europe, these policy levels are really not as integrated. We are happy to maybe put some public money in green venture capital funds, but at the same time, we start questioning, the transition away from the internal combustion engine. And so, there is no consistency in our policy mechanisms. And, when you have public money towards investments where the market actually is not so clear, that can be a very wasteful way of using public investments, actually. So the idea of coordinating politics, implementing agency procurement rules, and national and EU level vehicles, I think that's key. And I think so the two biggest opportunities to learn from China and low-hanging fruits, I think, for EU policymaking are better integration of EU level and national initiatives, especially in promotional development banks. And I think on this front, actually, the ETCI, the European Tech Champions Initiative of the EIF, and now the #2 version, are a very good example of where we can go with this. I think it can be very powerful. And then the other one is the more strategic and innovation-friendly, risk-prone approach to procurement, both public procurement, but also to push European corporates to become more comfortable with buying European innovation. So I think all of this is something that we should really learn seriously from China. I also have some concerns, though. And the first one goes back to what Kalim was saying not too long ago, and is about the role of EU government public venture capital in the context of the EU political economy. So there are, in general, two ways to think of public venture capital, and there is a tension between these two views. One is to, as a vehicle for public money to fund strategic technologies, more or less. And that's clearly what China is doing. Other is using public money to anchor an industry, the venture capital industry, and strengthen venture capital as an asset class that can then attract private investors. And Europe is very different from China because it has very limited capacity to direct private capital, and in fact, also limited capacity to unlock its public capital in a coordinated way. So in Europe, it's particularly important that the second mission, anchoring the private venture capital industry, is prioritized, in my view. Because without that, our capital base is going, total capital base, which ultimately is what matters, is going to be much smaller. So I think we need to be really clear about what we want to do with these vehicles. Are we using direct public funding for strategic sectors, or do we want to grow the pie a lot and then find mechanisms to ensure that a sleeve of that pie also goes towards what we think is most strategic? In my view, given what we are in Europe, there is no doubt that I would go for the second one. It's also more aligned with the SIU, the Saving and Investment Union agenda. So the second point is related, is about the importance of mobilizing private capital and especially pensions. So the point is that if you want to do that, the asset class needs to deliver 15-20% internal rate of return. Otherwise, they would not invest in venture capital as an asset class. And by the way, doing that is actually very hard. Venture capital is not an easy industry. It's an industry where it's only a small proportion of the funds that actually manage to deliver those returns. So my big fear is that if we retune the European government venture capital system towards one very focused on the strategic objectives, we will break a bit the toy that we spent 15-20 years building, and which is this industry that can and is starting to attract the private capital. And I'll conclude with a general consideration, which is that in general, innovation is very hard to predict, and also the venture capital is really not for all types of innovations. And when you try to push it to do that, it usually doesn't work, and it neither achieves what you want it to achieve, nor is sustainable. So in some way, I'm very interested in the Chinese lessons, and it's incredibly impressive what they've been doing, but they did very well at building capacity in strategic fields like EVs, batteries, wind turbines, etc., that are arguably not the type of thing that pure venture capital would fund. It's more like incremental innovation, manufacturing heavy. And by the way, this can be very impactful innovation. I'm not saying that it's not important, to the contrary. It's just not exactly the type of venture capital backable type of innovation. So I think it's very worthwhile to have this debate, but I think it's not exactly about retuning the venture capital model in Europe. It's about the other forms of finance, and maybe this connects a bit to the role of banks that Dora was talking about. Because instead, for frontier innovation, connects to sector picking, politically mandated sector picking can be quite tricky, and I'm generally quite skeptical of it for two reasons. The first is that the political cycle, especially in democracies, is so long that it very often risks being behind the curve. In Italy, it took 2 years to set up an AI-focused government venture capital fund. 2 years in AI is basically, a lifetime. And this is just one example. It's normal. It's normal for a democracy to take a long time to do these things. And then the other consideration is that innovation is unpredictable, especially its ripple effects and its positive externalities, right? It's capital and it's talent recycling. So if you think in Europe, just to give you one example, recently a new energy startup, Fuse, has become successful. The Financial Times wrote an article about it. So it's an energy startup, but it was founded by the two executives from Revolut, a digital fintech challenger bank. Who could predict that? And if we think about why Europe is so behind on artificial intelligence and will really struggle to compete with the US, it's because the US has huge digital corporates that can invest hundreds of billions of euros in the infrastructure. But which government guidance fund would have invested in an online book reseller 15 years ago, a social network platform to make fun of other people online, which would be Facebook, and even NVIDIA, the most strategic company, it was founded, and for a long time it was a chip designer for computer games. So
same for DeepSeek in China.
And okay, see, so I think if we want to be realistic, I don't think the political mandates would have really been able to predict these aspects. But I think this work that you are doing is incredibly valuable because we really should learn from China, and I think the more we learn, the more detailed work you do about it, the better we will be able to understand the right lessons from it. So keep going, and I'll be very happy to read and hear more. Thank you.
Lorenzo, we move immediately to the next commentator who will be online, Luke Schmitz, a researcher at Max Planck Institute for the Study of Society in Köln.
Yeah, thanks so much for including me in this event, and sorry not to make it in person. So I start also by tooting the horn of praise because this was a very rich report, and in typical Cornel Ban fashion, we get 3 papers for the price of 1. So the paper offers a very rich framework, and I think to also echo Lorenzo Moretti's point, I think the point that the comparison with China, even if Europe isn't China and can't become China, is non-trivial and very rich. It leads to a lot of insights that also will help my own work forward and inform these policy discussions that we're having. Now, let me start by sort of echoing what I think is also an important empirical observation in the paper that also informs my my points of thought and critique. So you note in passing that whenever the EU reaches for industrial policy tools, it produces a regulatory architecture rather than this balance sheet steering that we need. Now you treat it as a deficit, and I would rather treat it as a finding. And I think if we look at recent policy proposals, this becomes clear as well. If you look at the Industrial Accelerator Act, if ever there was a moment for the Commission to ship this kind of Chinese-style instrument with scale-up finance, it would be now. And instead, we get a series of regulatory instruments about procurement, about conditionality for foreign direct investment and critical raw materials and manufacturing zoning. And of course, all of this is very valuable and it's in many ways groundbreaking, but of course the scale-up financing arm is conspicuously missing. And also the competitiveness fund that was proposed last July is built on this InvestEU de-risking template and not on direct equity. So it seems that whenever Europe tries to be more Chinese, it ends up becoming more European, right? So that is to say, more of a rule setter and more of a demand shaper. Now, of course, the entire point of the report is to say that this regulatory capacity is too diffuse and uncoordinated to achieve these overarching transformational goals. And then the report, other than offering a fantastic diagnosis, also offers a menu of reforms. And I think here I start to move into my critique because I think you've identified the right wall, but you're reaching for the wrong keys, or at least your set of keys to unlock the doors of our escape room are sort of incomplete. So to go to the pension fund point, of course, this is right because this is where most of the money and most of the potential would sit. And the problem, obviously, is that the capital exists, but it's not moving. But the report then reaches for state aid doctrine as the main source of reform. The idea being that softening the rules to have public investors behave more like private investors and reinterpret the market economy operating principle, expanding the general block exemption regulation. All of this rests on an implicit theory that European public funds could act more directionally and the institutional money would then follow in. And I think here the diagnosis is a bit incomplete in the sense that these pension funds also face heavy capital penalties for holding unlisted equity under different sets of rules that have more to do with prudential rules and how much risk an insurer or pension fund portfolio is allowed to hold, right? So this is actually financial services regulation, and it's a different commission directorate, different agencies, different policy community, and a different kind of political economy. So even if you reinterpret the state aid rules, allowing us to write bigger checks, it might not move the money because the wall that holds it back wasn't held back by state aid doctrine in the first place. And I mean, to be a bit self-referential here, because I mean, you also kindly engage some of my work. I think the point here is that it's not that we need to have one coherent enough doctrine to unlock the capital, but rather that there's a series of locks that are scattered across different policy domains, from competition, financial services, corporate law, prudential supervision, and those doors are kept by different guardians that are connected to different democratic chains, and they have a different legitimacy story connected to them. So I think maybe not for this report because it's already very rich, but in sort of building on this work in the future, one thing you can do is to not look for one master key, but rather to map these different doors and what locks there are. I think that would be a sort of good follow-up exercise. Then I hope I'm not running out of time, because the other problem that I just want to highlight, it's an entirely different problem, but one I think that is sort of looming over the report. You touch on it, but it needs to be made, I think, more explicit, and that's a problem of economic geography. So as you also talk about in the presentation, these government guidance funds, they work best when the firms that need to scale are already embedded in dense supply ecosystems. So there's a very strong place-based nature to when these funds work. And the paper, I think, gestures at the politics here, but it underestimates the degree to which this is a roadblock for member states to sort of go more in this direction. Because if we do a thought experiment where we have a huge batteries or power electronics scale-up vehicle, we have 100 billion to funnel into ecosystems. There's a couple of places in Europe this could go to, right? It would likely go to Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, the French Battery Valley, Hungary, and maybe Catalonia or the Basque Country, right? Those are the places where this money can sort of be absorbed. But oftentimes these ecosystems sit in either bigger member states or regions that are better off. I think you can make a similar case about the semiconductor ecosystems that sit in, for instance, the Eindhoven, Brainport region, North Rhine-Westphalia, Saxony. And I mean, the paper talks about localization light, I think is the word you use as a political solution, but this might not be sufficient for the kind of ecosystem approach that is needed for quick scaling, right? And I feel like this is more of a general discussion point than a shortcoming of the paper, but we really need to make it very explicit that the politics here are such that we need to accept that not everything can happen everywhere. And in many ways, if we want the efforts to succeed, we must explicitly disavow from the idea that this is desirable at all, right? And I feel like here the Chinese, of course, have the advantage of planning this much more explicitly. If you think about the rollout of artificial intelligence, there's the West Compute, East Data approach, where all of this gets placed in the locations where it's most suitable to. But I mean, these things are political problems that Europe needs to grapple with. Anyway, I think those are two discussion points, and I'll stop there.
Looks like we might not have much time for discussion, but I think in a way this is a discussion already with all these contributions. So I invite Anca Dumitrescu, who is Policy Officer at DG Growth, European Commission, to make a comment.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Cornel, for this very insightful and relevant analysis. So I'm part of the chief economist team in DG Grow, and our role is actually to provide the evidence for the single market and industrial policy. So it is in this quality that I will be speaking today. And I think today's discussion is particularly relevant because it aims at really bridging the gap between research, the academic debate, the ongoing economic and political economy discussions around industrial policy, and then what do we do in terms of EU policy making. So very timely discussion. If I go back a bit to the overall context and how we actually are operating, I think we are at a key and pivotal moment in terms of recalibrating industrial policy at EU level. I will come back later to the financing part, but I think we need to understand that we are redesigning, basically, as Laszlo was mentioning, a new doctrine, a new approach. It may not be fully coherent, but it is a journey that we have embarked upon. And we are not alone. I mean, the global revival of industrial policy is a worldwide phenomenon. We have moved away from, those taboos around, picking the champions. And I think we are going towards more informed debates about how to design and implement effective industrial policies. So this is where we are now and where we need to discuss. We've seen in the last couple of years that our strategic dependencies, our supply chains vulnerabilities, our energy dependence are actually questioning our way of doing policy. And this also Europe's slower ability to upgrade from what is called, what Draghi mentioned as middle tech technologies towards high-tech technologies, towards new value chains and emerging critical value chains is also held back. Just give you some numbers, but Cornel has already mentioned them, different numbers, but they all speak to the same, it's the same story. We have fewer scale-ups than the US. A significant proportion of our scale-ups leave Europe as well, and they go somewhere else, 12% depending on the studies. So we are facing a series of what economists say, failures, market failures, but also coordination failures or institutional failures. Looking at value chain bottlenecks, learning by doing at the level, of firms, and also our slower ability to basically enter and nurture infant industries, because we are talking here about infant industries. So it is clear that business as usual policies, horizontal policies that have prevailed under the single market, let's say, approach, are no longer performing. They cannot address those deep, failures, and they do not help us nurture those infant industries. So we are aware of the diagnostic, and I think we are working internally in the Commission, in DG Grow, in recalibrating our industrial policy. I'm going to do a bit of publicity here because we have published also a paper with our Deputy Director General, Mai Verute, on actually how to recalibrate this industrial policy. You can check it. It's how Europe could get both the green and the deal. And as it was said before, for many decades, Brussels was known for its regulatory outreach, the Brussels effect. But we are moving beyond that. We have now expanded our tools and our, I'd say, arsenal of policy instruments, and we have embarked in a kind of policy experimentation. We are combining horizontal measures, the ones, we've been working for many decades, which is the deepening of the single market, removing the remaining barriers, with more vertical and targeted interventions. Take the Net Zero Industry Act that has a clear, clean tech focus. We have the Clean Industrial Deal looking at hard to abate sectors. We have sectoral plans. So we are going beyond the traditional horizontal measures. Besides doubling down on supply-side measures, such as, for instance, the Critical Raw Materials Act, we are also looking into demand-side measures, and this was mentioned before. If we take the Industrial Accelerator Act, it is a clear signal that we want to ring-fence demand for European industry through public procurement and local content requirements. So our industrial policy is becoming certainly more strategic in the sense that we try to address this triangle of objectives, which often has been not easy to manage, which is competitiveness, decarbonization, and economic security. How can you improve? I mean, is it perfect? Certainly not. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here discussing the topic. And I think there are two main ideas that I would take from Cornel's paper today. And I will repeat myself because this has been said before. Well, coordination, no surprise. We call this also alignment because it gives the idea that we all need to go into the same direction. So directionality and alignment. I think the conceptual framework that you use under the hyper-transformation paradigm with this four-circuit process is a very relevant, let's say, theoretical framework for understanding some of the failures, right, that we have in Europe. So it is a very powerful concept. And also, I like your idea of temporal misalignment. It's in your paper where you really show how the time scale of infrastructure and policy developments is often not synchronized with the time scales at firms level in terms of production and financial cycles. So under this conceptual framework, it helps us understand that this financing issue is not just a financing issue, it is a coordination issue. So it is a very useful framework, and I think it has the potential to further explain the interaction between the macro, the meso, and the micro level. So I'm looking forward more on this. And I think your analysis certainly echoes also our diagnosis, which is, as I said, about the need for further alignment. It is not about the Commission doing everything. It's certainly not what we are vouching. It is about having aligned direction in strategic areas. And I think this has been said before. 2, 3 examples. Alignment between industrial policy and competition policy. We need a competition policy that moves away from the static efficiency, right, towards a more innovation-friendly policy. A policy, in the word of, in the words of Philippe Aguillon, that, I'll finish, that supports structural transformation. Industrial policy and research and innovation policy, where industrial priorities fit directly into R&D priorities. So, first idea, coordination and more alignment. And second idea, what I liked in your paper is that indeed the financing of scaling up, how are we going to finance industrial scaling up? And what is the European way? That's actually the key question for policymakers, I think. How do we achieve European speed, scale, and impact, right? The ECF has been mentioned. I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but there is a focus there on more targeting, it is clear. And we certainly need to better understand at micro level, what are the financing needs of those industrial scale-ups? Okay, this is something, also a reflection undergoing in the Commission. Also at meso and macro level, what is the role of VC vis-à-vis other forms of financing? What is a way to put this together? What would be effective financing vehicles? How can we ensure scale for sustained periods of time? What governance is most suited given the risk aversion of European institutional investors? So all these are questions that we need to think collectively about. So to conclude, I think this research is extremely helpful to better understand how other major economies are scaling up their industries. And I would even add, knowing more about South Korea or Japan, with whom we share actually our industrial, let's say,
I have a different paper on that, so happy to
okay,
do it.
perfect. So this is extremely valuable. And I think we need this type of tailor-made knowledge with, based on country expert knowledge to support our policies. And last word, I think there are no recipes. I think we all agree. We need hard work and a lot of policy experimentation to make it work. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Unfortunately, we are running a bit behind the schedule, so I would like to ask those who are left from speakers who really cannot stay longer. So if you need really to intervene now, otherwise, we still have 3 commentators. And the next one would be Ramon Campagno, who is from Joint Research Center of European Commission, who joins online. And I ask everyone to be, please, disciplined in your timing.
Good day to everybody. Greetings from Seville. Colin, I have to admit I have not read the report because I'm replacing somebody else. But I promise to do this if you send it to me. And but I would like to give you a couple of ad hoc messages to your paper, which I liked very, very much. Yeah, and perhaps I will reveal a couple of issues that you have mentioned that have been already discussed and have been withdrawn. Okay, because I'm a member of the Startup Scale-Up task force of the Commission, and I know a little bit, and some of the issues you mentioned have already been discussed internally and did not work out. Your paper is basically on governmental venture capital, and I share with you that normally, and the paper that you cited has been established in our group. It is the one where we analyzed the governmental venture capital in Europe, that basically all of them have a series of objectives, missions, which is basically started with creating jobs and regional development. But with time, it become bigger and bigger and bigger. Reduce disparities, becoming greener, try to be a technology autonomy, and so on and so forth. And it gets each time more complicated. And basically, you are right. As long as your return on investment is not negative and you fulfill some of them, this is something what also works in Europe. This is similar in China, and I'm very good and happy to hear it. The problem I see is that we are asking too many things to these funds. Okay, I'm happy to send you a report we wrote on governmental venture capital, in which we showed that basically you have to do many things. For example, you have to be anti-cyclical. Okay, absorbing shocks. For example, the 30% you mentioned that of governmental venture capital is not constant. It depends on how the economic cycle is. And basically what happens is the governmental venture capital remains constant or is increasing slowly, but it's the private one which fluctuates and causes problems in the maturity of the saturation of the money for startups. You have to deal with unexpected shocks. For example, governmental impulses came with Corona because you had to pump money in. You have to assure the innovation pipeline. Yeah, here you correctly mentioned the issue of universities, and you have other things which are coming here, which in Europe, unfortunately, also changes. For example, the strategic policies that we had. You may remember that in the first mandate of the von der Leyen, everything was on the dual and green transition, but more and more we're adding things. For example, the dual use. Okay, and you have to take that into account, which means each time less money. Okay, and so what the problem is that things are getting each time more complicated. And I would agree with you that some of the things are correct, identified, but possibly we are not aware of the real problems that we have. I'll give you one example. Following a study we made, is only 20% of the VC is cross-border, okay? So if we were to increase the cross-border investments in Europe, we would solve part of the problem, but we are failing to do this, okay? Other issues is, and what I think we have to take into account, I think it's absolutely unreasonable to think that governmental driven venture capital will grow massively in the next years. If we take this as an exception, we possibly will fail. It will be at best be modest in order to compensate, but it will not be massive. I can't believe that this will be happening, seeing all the other important issues which have to be tackled and taken into account in the next MFF. Yeah, I think the best and more conservative scenario is how we do best or use best the money we have available. Okay, and here I tend to disagree a little bit with Anka. I don't think that it can be solved only by coordinating and aligning better. Okay, yes, we found that we had a huge number of funds in whole Europe, but even if you would align them at best, the order of magnitude of the money available is below those that we would need in order to make a significant change. So basically, the money must come somewhere else, okay? And there are not many options that are there. The issue of the pension funds, which has been mentioned by you, by Luc, and others, have a big problem. It is that they are so reticent to change it and we tried it already in many occasions, that except of Norway and Sweden where it has been implemented, I don't see that this will be changing in the foreseeable future that would have an impact directly on the area. We have perhaps to be more creative, yeah, and here perhaps we have to think about more on corporate VC, okay? And I give you a number that we found. It is that there are two striking numbers that really worry me. Did you know that European corporates invest more in your American startups than in European ones? We can demonstrate this in the area of automotive, which is even more striking because it's one of the areas that we should be supporting more. But even more is that the level of investments by corporates into the VC, into the startup and scale-up landscape is smaller than their share it should be, taking into account or comparing it with internal investments you're doing. Okay, so this would be perhaps an area that we should be try to find more leverage that corporates come into it. Another one is individual investors. Okay, I'll give you an example from Spain. To be investing in non-liquid assets, the ceiling was 100,000 euros, and not a lot of people have 100,000 euros to invest in liquid assets over 10 or 15 years. But now it has been reduced to 10,000 euros, and see, it happens, it has already had a little bit of its impact, okay? Why I'm mentioning this, but I would like to come back to the point. We should be using better the money of the venture, of the governmental one, of the public one, in some focus areas, okay? I give you an example of what I mean, where one of my favorite areas is we should be investing more in universities VCs. As you correctly said, Cornel, we don't have many venture capital funds run by universities, which are the ones which are doing the deep techs. The deep techs and the hardcore startups do normally not come from people on the street. No, they come from scientific hard scientific basis, and these are funded in universities. And we find that this is a big problem, okay? Why has it not been so far? It is that basically the European institutions face with one big problem. There are two ways to give money, either direct or indirect. Indirect is you give it via funds of funds, and normally you put as a condition that should be a co-investment in order to avoid crowding out. The other one is the direct finance, and this is the one that you mentioned correctly, the EIC, and this has been focused very strongly in the last period, and basically due to the strategy that was set up last year. And in fact, it goes in this direction. So for example, you will see that there are specific calls on specific areas, for example, on fusion, on biotech, and so on and so on. The problem with this is that direct financing for the public hand is very expensive, while indirect financing is pretty much lower cost. So you have only a limit until where you can go. So this is basically ad hoc reactions to your talk, not having read the report, so please excuse if something I didn't match correctly. But there is one thing I would like that perhaps you can spend 1 minute on it. It is that you said that the EU is closer to China than to the US, which I tend to agree. But at the same time, you said that China is putting the regions into competition, if I have understood it well. This is an interesting asset because it's a little bit different than the ones we have done here in Europe. Here we had, for example, more the idea of smart specialization strategies or others, but not necessarily that you have to compete as a region. And perhaps this is an asset that I don't know if it might be a lateral thinking view for the European Union. Okay, I leave it there. And I thank you very much for the presentation, which I found fantastic.
Thank you so much. We are moving now to Philip Lausberg, finally. And then we have also Alicia, if she can still wait.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Philip Lausberg, Senior Policy Analyst at the European Policy Center. Thanks to FEPS for organizing this great event, but also, of course, to Cornel Ban. The paper is extremely useful, I find, especially providing these insights into the very successful Chinese model where we can take some important learnings. I'll be quick diving into it. I'm not going to spend too much time on the good things because I think most of them have been said already. And maybe, one thing that maybe has been mentioned less, I think the whole issue of competition policy, so that we need a different logic that allows for more scale and European champions when competition comes largely outside of the EU nowadays, and this was built, the current system was built in a different age. I think that's something that is important to note that you rightly underline. And then, of course, the whole coordination problematic that Europe is facing. But I will dive a little bit deeper into the European public financing architecture and what you've said also about the MFF, ECF, and so on. Also in your sort of second round of text that you sent after we gave you the reviews. So I think you talked about the MFF having this advantage of being a 7-year plan, sort of having this advantage of consistency. And I think that what's proposed by the Commission kind of undermines that a little bit. So what we've seen now is more flexibility, allocation being decided by the annual budgetary procedure, and work programs that can be adjusted quite ad hoc also by the Commission. So I think that has its justification because of recurrent crises, technological changes, and so on. But I think it's going a little bit too far in that direction, and it runs kind of counter the idea of long-term goals and providing reliable investment signals and also predictability to the private sector, which are factors that you, of course, underline as being very important. I think also what's sort of missing in the current proposal is the sort of clearer prioritization. So we have the 4 windows, as you said, in the competitiveness fund. But if you look into the details, I mean, these 4 windows include so many different technologies, so many different areas. I mean, if you some of them up to 140. So if you look at the green window, you have things in there like sustainable tourism, which is great. But if we want to concentrate on cutting edge and we want to have the the necessary resources to support scale-ups, then I think we cannot afford this. Same with geographical spread, which is not in there now, but there's a lot of political pressure, of course, for that. I think another issue there is sort of the risk aversity issue that you talk about, of course. So using NPBIs, so national promotional banks, and also pension funds and so on that you mentioned are, the big sort of levers that Europe could use, is a great idea, but a lot of them have these AAA ratings they want to stick to. They have very conservative shareholders like the EIB. So I think if you want to have more risk aversity and that you need to somehow be able to reform that. I think you also don't talk that much about InvestEU. I think this is an instrument that has its merits. I think it suffers from risk aversity, but having only a focus on equity, I think, is going too short here. And I think InvestEU, with its guarantee and also mainly backing up loans, can be very useful when it comes to infrastructure financing, for example. So I think that model to shifting everything to equity, I think is not the solution. I think it's been said by a couple of people already as well. I think also you are sort of criticizing this idea of crowding in private investment too much. I think it's. I mean, maybe it's. Don't mean it that strictly speaking, but I think the idea that you use public money to crowd in private investments is crucial, especially since we don't have the same fiscal depth. And you had the recent EIB investment report where it really showed, we're barely keeping up the level of investment now, but it's mainly driven by public investment, but we won't be able to keep that up. So now it's going to be more necessity for private investment. And I think you say something like public money deployed to attract private capital rather than to substitute for it where private capital will not go. I think this is not a contradiction. So if you have a crowding in approach and you take public money into these places where the private money doesn't go, it can still attract private funding following it. So I think it should be combined with this approach. And I think one of the issues then is really, do we have the enough de-risking intensity? So do we have the resources that can have this, make this approach of crowding and private investment work? And for that, I think one of the problems of instruments like InvestEU now is that it's not only the risk aversity of the implementing partners, it's also that the guarantees that are used, the coverage is not large enough. The resources that are given for these projects are not covering enough. So if you use more intensity of risk de-risking, I think then you can also go a long way. And here, of course, the shortage of resources kicks in again. And there, I think we need a clear prioritization when it comes, for example, to the ECF. We cannot have 140 different micro priorities in every window. You need to choose a few of them and then go all in. Of course, that's politically almost 10 every 5 years. Yeah, something like that. I think the Netherlands, they had initially in their sort of high-tech funding project, and I mean, this is they had, I think, 10 priorities. They basically reduced them to 2. So basically just chips and was it AI? I can't remember. But it's basically that kind of approach that we need more, I would say. And then when you talk about the NRPPs, so the national and regional partnership plans, where you say, that should also be more equity, it should be more specific industries. There I tend to disagree, because I believe we need a strong cohesion policy as well to sort of balance the inequalities we have across regions. So, I mean, if you look at, for example, Letta, he says in his report, we have the single market as one side of the coin, but we need the cohesion policy as the other side of the coin. If you have a level playing field, you need to also be able to sort of keep development levels at least similar. So I agree with you that, it should be much more conditional. It should be supporting European public goods. It should support projects that have a European impact, that they increase the synergies there. But to just reduce it to the sort of excellence-based funding, I think that it would be dangerous politically, and I think it would also not be good from an economic perspective. But again, I think this is more, I would nuance that much more. Then, yeah, coordination, I think here, the Commission has talked about this competitiveness coordination tool for a while now. I mean, after Draghi introduced that idea, but it's really not clear what it looks like, And I think that's one of the weaknesses of the MFF proposal as well, that this kind of governance, the level of how governance is organized, and also the priority setting, the high-level priority setting, is not clear. So they talk about this report coordination. I can't remember what it's called. Some sort of coordination report that they want to use to then inform policymaking and investment decisions in, for example, the competitiveness fund. But I think that needs to be much more, much clearer. And in our think tank at the EPC, we have suggested just to use the semester and beef it up and use that infrastructure that already exists, and then come up with clear, industrial policy and economic, macroeconomic goals that the substructure of the MFF should then serve to. I think another important factor that I think you touch upon as well is the demand for capital. So we see low corporate investment in Europe. We have European companies have corporate balance sheets that are often strong. But at the same time, businesses tend to prioritize savings, incremental investments over ambitious risk-taking, and particularly in those R&D intensive frontier technologies and industries that you mentioned. And I think that is, even if you have more financing, if you don't have the projects you can invest in, then you also have a problem, of course. So, and here I think it's this sort of more holistic approach of looking at fragmented markets, trade barriers, the uncertainty that comes with lack of demand and things like that need to be tackled. So, of course, single market needs to be advanced. But also demand measures, I think, have that justification. And of course, China has that state-backed demand, and it uses it very powerfully. So what we would need is more sort of public-private cooperation on demand signals, on off-take agreements and things like that. I think some of that was mentioned by previous presenters here. But also cross-border industrial alliances. And here we see last year, Mistral and ASML built an alliance that would go, would be an example of this. Of course, that has again to do also with the fragmentation we're facing in markets that could facilitate that. Makes this more difficult. But that's the kind of spirit I think we need also among big European corporates, that you band together and build these alliances. And I think the IIA, the Made in Europe approach, again, also has that. It has its justification. Again, I think it needs to be integrated in a coherent whole, where you combine that with scale up and industrial policy. On private financing, you talk about, in general, I think the whole savings and investment union agenda, you can't discount it. Maybe mention it a little bit more, I would say, because of course, this is a key aspect to Europe's backwardness when it comes to scale up. You talk about pension funds. I think an important factor are also insurance companies. Europe doesn't have a lot of second and third pillar pensions, but we have extremely strong insurance companies. Some of them are world leaders. So I think, I mean, there's reforms of Solvency II and so on. I think there's a lot being done at the moment, but these are important players that are very interested to invest more in cross-border infrastructure and so on. They're also interested in having more liquid assets when it comes to some of these asset classes. So what at the EPC, what we've suggested, for example, as well, to use EU-backed projects, for example, through InvestEU, where you have loans and then securitize them and build a market for that. So you have already a de-risked element in there, and then have a securitized asset that you could, expand through your EU securitization platform that it builds, the regulatory framework for that, and builds this asset class that could provide the liquidity that especially these institutional investors appreciate. Same with asset management companies that take the money of private households, so-called private households, so more high net worth individuals, but also just your more higher middle class income people who do invest, but who cannot invest enough sort of in those instruments that make a difference, like private equity, VC, and so on. The legislation is quite restrictive in that respect at the moment. So, which actually touches on a project the EPC is launching now on sort of more how to mobilize more private investment for strategic goals. So you can look out for that. There's going to be some events and publications hopefully soon. Yeah, and I think also when it comes to the whole regulatory framework, so I mean, of course, the EU has been a regulatory superpower, as we all know, has used that tool as the main tool. It clearly has its limits, but now we talk about simplification a lot, about reducing complexity. But also, I think the regulatory framework, how to regulate business in Europe, has been very much about this think small first principle, where you say, okay, the main focus is SMEs, but it's less on scale-ups. It's less on saying, what about our mid-caps? What about our scale-ups? How can we do something there? I think this is being tackled as well. We have this new mid-cap category. But from your side, I think it would be interesting to hear as well how China deals with regulatory burdens, how it deals with complexity, with all the, those issues that have been criticized also when it comes to EU financing. Thank you very much. Sorry for taking too much time.
Thank you so much.
Very comprehensive. I think if Cornel incorporates all the comments, we will end up with 10 papers instead of one. Okay, so we have one more commentator who is left. It's Alicia Garcia Herrero, who is a senior fellow at Bruegel, and she's an expert on China. So, Alicia, thank you.
A real expert on China.
And is
real, not, I'm not an analyst.
And so, Alicia, thank you for waiting, and you're welcome with your comments.
Well, first of all, thank you for your patience, because I feel like any minute you're going to kind of switch off because you've heard so much, and I have to say I learned enormously, and I plan to learn much more because I've not yet received the paper, the report, and therefore everything I'm going to say is basically, my knowledge, and hopefully it'll be useful. But again, with that big caveat that I've not read the paper, just listen to the presentation. So maybe, after everything I've heard, first of all, I think it was really fascinating, both the China angle, but also learning about Europe. We're now actually writing a policy brief on China's AI and comparing it to Europe, and a lot of what you have been saying in a way is reflected in this policy brief, because I feel that specific sector shows very well where the differences are. And I would say that the differences are firstly on speed, and the question is why? Why is there this big difference in speed? And I think that the main reason is not only because China is centralized, or there's many autocratic regimes with centralized models. It's not that. It's that I think China is very kind of, it's designed in its development model to feel the pain of falling behind. And this is part of China's history. And we've not been there. Somehow we might be there very soon, or maybe we are and we haven't realized. But I think that idea of emergency that China has had for so long is something that we should incorporate. And I think that explains a lot of the things they do. If you look at AI regulation, for example, I mean, we may think that their regulatory environment is very tight, and it actually isn't, because they've changed it again. And why have they changed it? Because they were falling behind. So, that speed of change is something we're not contemplating, in my view, in the way we should. So that's one thing I wanted to share. If I go back to my research on China's innovation, on the one hand, on critical technologies, this is what I've been working on, and on industrial policy, a few things to share. First, I think it's good to hear that China has been doing great in innovation and in industrial policy, but perhaps epistemologically speaking, what a long word, I think we need to realize that China's industrial policy is actually much broader than innovation-related industrial policy. That is the kind of I would say that the end of the cake, the nicest part, but there's a lot of, miserable use of industrial policy in China that maybe we're not discussing. So in other words, not everything we see as illuminating is what's happening in China. Just a number. We actually, I never published that paper, to be frank, because I fell behind and then I felt it was outdated. But I calculated all of China's subsidies, direct and indirect, and then there was this IMF paper coming up with the number of 4.6% of GDP in subsidies or related. I had a slightly bigger number, to be frank, but anyway, long story short, 80% of that is going to nothing of what we're talking about. Nothing. I mean, it's all sectors that, or SOEs, or sectors where, they just use the subsidies to survive. I mean, so there's a lot of inefficiencies in China's industrial policy. Now, let's focus on what I think this discussion is all about, and is that innovation-related industrial policy. So some of your comments were, okay, is it effective because it's government-driven, or these government-guided funds? I've been looking into government-guided funds. I have a slightly less positive view, to be frank, of this. I'm not saying some are not successful, but because I do work in an investment bank in Hong Kong, I know some of them, like directly. There's a lot of misuse of funds. It's very non-transparent. A lot of them are actually a way to hide subsidies, to be frank. So I'm not. I mean, again, my universe is not as big, but I would say so. I'm not sure that's what we should take with us. But what I think we should take with us is that on the scaling, the idea of signaling, and that I don't think has been mentioned yet, or maybe I missed it. So I did an empirical analysis of the so-called 10,000 Little Giants, which is a big industrial policy arm of China after the Made in China 2025, in my opinion, probably the second most relevant. And we actually took all of the companies that had been selected because there's data, which there isn't for the Made in China 2025. So we have the criteria at the local government level that they should have complied with, and we have the selected companies. We take all of the listed companies, the others we can't, but there's a lot, like 10,000. Sorry, there's more, like 20,000, and then there's already like 8,000 little giants already selected. So, in some sectors, you can kind of compare apples and pears, or apples and apples, because we control for the size and look why was that company selected and not that other? So the good news is that the selection criteria are very good in my view. They're mostly related to whether they spend in R&D. They should be relatively profitable, not like a hugely loss-making. To your point of China doesn't like to throw out the money. Only on that old industrial policy that we're not discussing here. They throw a lot of that money, but that's not the focus here. So if I focus on the 10,000 little giants, first good lesson is they care for innovation. Second, they don't want to throw money on ever loss-making institutions. Fine, all of that is fine. But actually, there's a criterion that is very interesting, is that you should be doing what you get money for. If you are an EV company, you get money for EV, out of the EV pocket. Actually, only 20% of those companies getting the money are doing what they say they're doing, because we have a kind of business concentration out of their annual reports and financial statements. So no, they're not doing. So you could have a noodle, making company getting funds for EVs. The interesting about China, thing about China is that noodle company may actually be successful. So you see, can we replicate that? That's so, for me, maybe learning from China is not so much learning about their government schemes, or it's mostly about how can they be so quick and so innovative in their DNA, for God's sake. It's unbelievable. And I think sometimes I feel China is successful notwithstanding, rather than, with the support of the government. This is sometimes my reading. I feel like I'm not sure these policies are so good. I mean, some might, but that's not the secret. Sometimes I feel they're good notwithstanding their policies. For example, IPOs. We're talking about scaling. You know how hard it is to do an IPO? They reformed the IPO system, thanks God, because before it was really all about capital allocation. It was all about who is friends with. Now it is slightly easier, but still very hard. So the signaling, I go back to my point. The best about the 10,000 little giants is that it did act as a signaling. So if you were selected as a little giant, you could then do an IPO.
Alicia, can you please wrap up?
Yes, I will. So just to say that I think learning from China is very difficult, because we may focus on an instrument or, you name it, and the trick is elsewhere. Just I wrap up with one number from our critical technology paper, which is really, really astonishingly bad for Europe. So it's not about how many amazing patents we have in AI or quantum or semis, which is what we focus on. We don't do very well except in quantum, but in quantum we're similar to China. So what's our problem then? Is it scaling? No, it's also the fact that even for innovation, we don't have a single market. We look at, spillovers of innovation across different countries within Europe, comparing it to China or the US. So they managed to kind of replicate US innovation, even with export controls, much faster than Europe. Like I'm telling you, 3 times faster. So for me, we need to understand, more than money, more than anything, is why are we slow? I mean, why don't we have this integrated innovation system where somebody said it, companies, where there's more of that, more? Is it because of nation barriers? Is it? And just, I finish here because this is very important and very contrarian, and probably, I wonder. Bear in mind that China's success in many sectors start with huge protectionism, including AI. They closed the market. This was true for the internet. This is true for AI. Try ChatGPT, try any except Grok. Even in Hong Kong, it's closed. And why? Because they prefer their own companies. Is it something we should do or not? Because we learn a lot of lessons, but we don't. There are lessons we don't dare learn, or we don't want to learn. Maybe we shouldn't learn. I don't know. But that is a very basic lesson about China. Whenever they are successful, it's because they've closed the market to competition. So what do we do about that? And that's it. Thank you.
It's a very interesting comments, provocative. So I'm very sorry we ran very much past our time, and I think the planning was a bit too ambitious with so many speakers. But I think this was a very rich discussion, and we all learned a lot, and probably, and I hope this is not the last time, because this project of EU Investment Capacity Group, it will continue this year, and so we will discuss these issues more. So at this point, I want to thank everyone for the participation. We will publish the paper in about 3 weeks, maybe early May, and you will all have pleasure to read it.
I do want to mention one thing. So in the study, we do a meta study of, I think it's 22 quantitative evaluations of when these funds work or not, in what combinations and so on. So I think there are grounds for being skeptical of what some of them do, but these are statistical findings that are pretty, it's a very clear consensus between both studies made inside China and outside. And so I would defend the proposition that they do matter quite a lot to explain the speed. But I think we need a lot more research to figure out, and the transparency is a big problem. I mean, it really is. Some of the stuff is more transparent than you think. There are data sets you can buy, but when you try to do trying to do an organizational study, forget about that, right? You can go into shadowing of a financial institution. I mean, that's hard in Europe too, but in China it's like, forget it. So we do have this problem of limitations of access to real inside the room kind of information. But yeah, thank you so much to the contributors, to the commentators, and we'll send you, of course, the final version.